You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Major European countries, for example, the UK and France, sided with the US in carrying out last week's airstrike on Syria. Some say that is a marked improvement after a series of incidents that soured relations among allies across the Atlantic. The show of so-called solidarity did little to keep the leaders of Britain and France from answering tough questions over the attack back at home.
The British Prime Minister tried hard to convince Parliament she is a little more than just a follower of Mr. Trump.
Let me be absolutely clear. We have acted because it is in our national interest. It is in our national interest to prevent the further use of chemical weapons in Syria. So we have not done this because President Trump asked us to do so.
In France, President Macron was proud of his vaunted influence on US President Donald Trump.
Il y a 10 jours, le président Trump disait les États-Unis d'Amérique ont vocation à se désengager de la Syrie. Nous l'avons convaincu qu'il était nécessaire d'y rester.
Though the White House denied the French president's claim, the airstrike on Syria did reunite the Atlantic allies under a common goal. Germany also voiced support, although it didn't join the military action.
It
is nothing special for Germany to support the deployment by its allies and friends, but not participate militarily. This happens the other way around too. You see this in other military missions in which our forces are deployed, while other allies do not send troops themselves, but absolutely support the mission.
Since President Trump took office, relations between the US and Europe have been strained over issues including US withdrawal from the Paris climate deal, trade friction, the Iran nuclear deal, moving the US embassy to Jerusalem, and immigration. The airstrike was the first action that reunited the US and Europe after a long time of strained relations.
So what about that strike against Syria, and will the relations between the United States and the UK and France on the mend after that airstrike on Syria? We are now joined in our Beijing studio, Li Guofu, who is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Washington, D.C. in the U.S., Harlan Ullman, who is a senior advisor of the Atlantic Council. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Berlin, in Germany, Joseph Rommel, who is the editor of the yearbook of the German Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome. And in London, the UK, Ian Beck, professor at the European Institute and co-director of Darendorf Forum from the London School of Economics and Political Science. I want to welcome the very strong panel. Let me begin with you, sir, Mr. Beck. Professor Beck, what do you make of the ongoing marathon session at the Parliament about whether or not the UK should strike together with the United States against Syria to begin with?
Well, what that is mainly about is the fact that in previous prime ministerships, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Tony Blair, Parliament was consulted before military action was taken. Now, this is a relatively new doctrine. It was only initiated largely around the Iraq War. And what Parliament has been doing is saying, well, why has Theresa May now broken with this new approach, which is to get parliamentary authority first? Her argument is that it had to be done quickly and decisively because the disgrace, the outrage of use of chemical weapons was something that had to be responded to.
Okay, we're going to come back about what exactly is going on right now in the UK about that. Let me go to Germany. Mr. Ullman, let me ask you about this. Of course, Germany did not strike militarily against Syria, and yet only offering verbal support coming from the administration. That, of course, has a lot to do with your history, the past experiences. But having said that, though, how do you make about German counselor support verbally for the cause, and yet the majority of Germany seems have quite different opinion?
Well, there has been a red line. Chemical weapons obviously have been used. You have to condemn that. But I wouldn't dig too deep into Germany's history. We have been participating before. I mean, the simple truth is for a military strike, you need a military that's functioning. German military is not up to the challenge. Not many airplanes are flying. If you had read The Economist or other pieces in the recent past, you would know German military is not really ready for strikes.
But what about the public opinion? What about the public opinion, Mr. Brammel?
Can't hear anybody.
Okay, let me move on to the United States. I'll come back to you to Germany. Mr. Ullman, right now we understand some of the congressmen coming from the Foreign Relations Committee of the Capitol Hill talking about drawing up some new rules regarding the highest executive branch, the White House, use of military power. What do you make of the potential of these new rules, given your inside knowledge?
First, the criticisms of the policies of this administration and the last administration rest in the fact that there's no strategy. The Obama administration and the Trump administration really have no workable plan to deal with ending the conflict in Syria, in large part because there may not be a viable plan. But regarding the authorization to use military force, both President Obama and President Trump are relying on an authorization to use military force passed by Congress in 2003, when the Islamic State did not exist and we were not engaged in Syria. I find it ludicrous, I find it embarrassing, and I find it against the law and offensive that the United States has continued to use military force without Congress passing the authorization, and I find this as an abrogation of power by the U.S. Congress, and unfortunately a sad indicator of why the American government is not working the way it should.
Okay, having said that though, let me move on to Professor Begg. The War Powers Act, that is also another piece of legislation that the UK is considering right now. It is going to limit the power of the executive branch, meaning the Prime Minister's use of military power against any other nation state. So tell me about that, and what does it mean, particularly when the majority of the Brits seems to be, at this point at least, against this strike in Syria?
Well, there has been no public opinion poll on the strike itself. The idea of a War Powers Act has been put forward by the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, as something that would oblige any government contemplating an act of war to have the prior authorization of the House of Commons. It would be, in some ways, a break with British constitutional history, because what's called the royal prerogative, which is vested in the Prime Minister, has always been used to authorize necessary military action, obviously as defined by the Prime Minister, in a way which gives freedom of maneuver in dealing with this. If you then say, well, no, you can only act militarily if you have prior authorization from Parliament, there's a clear risk of delay, and that's the principal reason for opposing it.
Okay, let me continue with this discussion about that. In the U.S., for example, Mr. Ullman, that specific legislation or policy, likely, by the Capitol Hill, we do not know whether it will eventually become a realization, but it will limit the president's use of military power against any nation state, even though the president will still have the freedom to use military power against the Taliban, against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, but not against any nation state. So what would that mean? Will there be, if that legislation comes into being, any further attack, for example, on Syria or some of the other countries, if not in the name of against ISIS?
Of course not. The War Powers Act that was passed during the Vietnam War to limit the president was meant that if force is used, the president has to report back to Congress on a recurring basis. Right now, the president, as commander-in-chief, can authorize a strike. This was particularly true in the nuclear years when, if nuclear war were to break out, there would not be a sufficient time to convene Congress. And so a new War Powers Act is not going to have any really constraining effect on the president, because Article 1 of the Constitution states that the president is commander-in-chief. He will have to consult. If he needs a declaration of war, that's one thing. But what is really needed now, as you noted, is a new authorization to use military force, because quite frankly, The one passed in 2003 is not going to work today.
Okay.
But the question you asked about U.S. and European relations, they are not going to improve. There are too many points of friction. This is a one-off. The President wants to reduce our presence in Syria.
All
the
right.
President still is moving forward with policies that are opposed by many in Europe.
All right. We're going to go to some of details about that question later. But for now, Mr. Li, here in Beijing, you've been attentively listening to your other colleagues talking about from their domestic political framework, how does that work or didn't work. Here's the thing. Domestically, they do have their own political issues to figure out about the nature of the strike and whether there will be future strikes related to what is already happening. But on the international framework, the UN, for example, we haven't seen the UN play a significant role this time. Even in the Security Council, China and Russia voted against the strike. So what do you make of the divided opinion as well on the international framework, not only in these domestic framework that the other guests have been talking about?
I think this is the problem, and also, the effect of reality we face with regard to the UN Security Councils. We know that, the Syria, and why, one member of the security, a permanent member, and Russia has said, this kind of a chemical, attack, against the civilians was a kind of fabrications, was, fake news. Certainly, any sort of Western tech would be against. As for China, our formal position is against any use of chemical weapons. But since the international investigator now was in Damascus, so we would like to see the conclusion after the investigators the mission. So before you draw sort of a conclusion and use the force, I think this is not normal. This is one of the major reasons China, voted against, this kind of UN resolutions.
We see the division that is going on within the international community and certainly also within the political framework that we mentioned in these countries. But what about the other question? Mr. Ullman earlier mentioned about whether this will be an occasion which would reunite the United States and some of its allies, whose relationship over the years, at least over the past 1 year, has went sour, to say the least. Professor Begg, what about your assessment?
Well, I think it's too early to say that one particular military strike is a signal that relations are improved, because there are so many other areas that you mentioned in your introduction where there is division, not just between Europe as a whole and the United States, but also within Europe. Some countries very much regret some of the actions that the US has taken. Some are more comfortable with them. If you take one or two concrete examples, I read in the press that Macron is very close to President Trump, the French president, whereas he refuses to take Angela Merkel's phone calls. Now, that's not a recipe for strong collaboration across the Atlantic. And part of the reason for the concern about Germany's position is very obviously the potential trade wars that are being initiated by Trump's actions. So you need to look at individual dossiers to get a good understanding of this.
But about the UK, Mr. Begg, I mean, the Prime Minister, obviously this time, seems to be in a way obliged to follow the American strike, because earlier the UK accused the Russians of so-called poisoning the double agent. The United States, at least the Trump administration, was jumping out and supporting the British stance. So is there something like a give and take in a way, Mr. Begg, in this regard?
Always, yes. There's always going to be give and take. But I think that we perhaps lose sight of the fact this is not just about Europe and the United States. It's also about trying to contain Russia, because Russia is being perceived by the Western allies collectively as having taken too many cavalier steps. Ukraine, Crimea, the poisoning of Skripal, now the tolerance of what's going on in Syria. All this seems to point to a Russia that is becoming increasingly unacceptable to the international community.
Professor Begg is really pointing to us something very clear about this. That is, whether this is about against Russia. The strike against Syria is in a way directing at Russia. Mr. Brummel, do you think this will be able to unite United States and its allied players, at least on the issue of Russia? Will the so-called unity against Russia bring these countries closer?
I'm not sure whether this has all been about Russia. Trump has been hyping that up for domestic consumptions. We shouldn't forget Mueller is investigating the Russia case, so he needed to sound tough. Putin was happy because finally Russia was taken seriously again, not just dealt as a regional power as Obama did. I think that was a lot of hot air in the so-called Cold War. The real thing America is after is Iran. Iran is the other state supporting Assad, and if it were up to the new security advisor at his right, John Bolton, Iran would have already paid a price, but this time it did not. I would be very careful in Tehran. America is ready. In May, mid of May, we won't see Europe and United States united because the U.S. will cancel the deal. Europeans won't be happy. To go back to your questions you posed at the beginning.
Yes. So, Mr. Ullman, comes to your term as well. What about that? If it's not about Russia, or maybe it's partly about Russia, maybe it's partly about the Middle East, but at least there is a strike. Will this strike be able to unite the United States and its good old days allies together, the UK and France, on something that they see will have a potential to be working together, whether that cause is justified or not? Mr. Ullman.
The simple answer is no, not a chance. Europeans do not trust President Trump. Apparently, he has decided not to impose further sanctions on Russia. The reason for the strike was that the United States needs to do something. It could not stand up and watch chemical weapons being used. But on the other hand, we're watching civilians and children being killed regularly by barrel bombs and explosives, and it's difficult to tell the difference. The fundamental problem is that the president is ambivalent about Russia. He refuses to condemn Mr. Putin, and the United States, while it regards as its two principal adversaries, China and Russia, has not taken any steps that we can see to deal with so-called Russian active measures, that is interference in our politics, the politics in Europe and other countries, with propaganda, with fake news. And so unless or until we develop a strategy for dealing with Russia, not a military strategy, but a diplomatic and political strategy, the alliance is going to be strained. People will continue to suspect Russia, continue to suspect Donald Trump's motives, both here and abroad. And quite frankly, the Mueller investigation that you cited is drawing a noose, I think, tighter and tighter around the president's neck, or at least his family, and that's going to make life much more complicated in America for the president.
Well, don't just say it is the American president that is not very clear about his stance on Russia. We also see the French president, Macron, for example. Mr. Begg from Europe, maybe I can have you to help us to understand that. I mean, he earlier said before the going to Russia will be part of his plan, and after the attack, he still said so. So we see a lot of different kinds of tangles going on among different players. It seems that the issue of Syria is not really going to play a big role there, Mr. Begg. How should we understand that?
Well, I think you're right. Many dances, many tangos, many partners going on. And the story behind all this, I think, is that we're in a very febrile period of international relations where it's not quite clear who's friendly with whom, or even within a country, who you should be speaking to. Much of your discussion so far has focused on Trump, but we shouldn't forget that there's a whole military and security apparatus behind Trump who try to control what he does and constrain what he does in ways which emerge in the form we saw this strike last week, which is a very limited strike of 100 cruise missiles or something, rather than something much more comprehensive that could have been more provocative to Russia. So let's not leap ahead in analysing this too deeply at the moment, because it's, as you say, tangoing going on in different directions.
All right, I will take that advice not to look for even further, at least for now, but look at America's foreign wars after the World War II. Take a look at history, could help us to understand probably reality as well. History shows, some suggest, how slight interventions, so-called, can lead to so-called greater involvement as well. The use of chemical weapons may be unacceptable, but the response of the U.S., Britain, and France to Syria's use of such tactics raises serious concerns about the future, too. We can see the list of wars that the U.S. fought. I mean, Mr. Ullman, I have to go to you because you are a veteran yourself. If you would think about the history that you experienced as a veteran and then as a policy analyst about the U.S., what has been its track record, just to be frankly, and also particularly about the loss of credibility in the war of Iraq, particularly the so-called weapons of mass destruction. I was a Washington correspondent then. I remember very clearly every, quote, evidence being shown then, not necessarily found out on the site of Iraq. So, Mr. Ullman, what about that?
I have a book that has just come out several months ago called Anatomy of Failure. Why, since the end of World War II, has America lost every war it started? In particular, Vietnam, that was started over an attack on American ships that never took place. You talked about the second Iraq War. And even in relatively minor interventions, we failed. Libya in 2011. And the fundamental problem in America is that we tend to elect presidents who lack the experience, who lack the judgment, and who are sadly underinformed on these situations. That is certainly true today. And so therefore, the comments about the American military, particularly Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Joe Dunford, exercising caution and restraint, is because these two officers know very well that too often America has used force when it shouldn't. And so therefore this check on any president seems to me to be vital, because we don't want to start another war needlessly that could easily expand, and that was one of the issues in Syria.
All right.
If some of the more radical views such as John Bolton took hold and we had a much broader attack that included against Russia, heaven knows what would have happened.
Well, we all know that.
The shadows of 1914, when a couple of bullets started World War I, should not be forgotten. I'm not suggesting a war, but we need to have caution because of all these entanglements and all these complicated situations in which there are no really longer complete friends and complete enemies.
All right. Of course, no war would be a great option. Meanwhile, whether we should have military strike is also a big question, I guess. Whether there is enough evidence to begin even a military strike. But having said that, though, we only have 1 minute left, so I want to give the other three guests also some chance to talk before we go. 20 seconds for every one of you. What do you think, where things are going from here about Syria from your perspective? Let's go to Mr. Brommel first. 20 seconds for you, sir. Thank you.
For me, Syria is just a sideshow. Stay focused on Iran. The deal will be called off. There will be preemptive strikes maybe before the congressional elections. And China will be impacted as well, because China is importing oil and gas from that region. So stay tuned. Prices will be higher. Russia will enjoy those higher prices as well.
Okay. Mr. Begg, 20 seconds.
Well, I think what we must be aware of, above all, is what you might call unintended consequences. It happened in Sarajevo in 1914. It could happen just as easily in Syria. And we have a difficult environment, because solving the Syrian civil war would be the answer. And yet, by degrading Assad, we risk prolonging the Syrian civil war.
I see.
So there's a paradox there at the heart of it.
Mr. Lee, I have to say, 10 seconds for you only left. Go ahead, sir.
I think, we have to always remember, whatever, the reason behind the military strike, the sufferers are the people on the ground.
All right. As simple as that, as heart-hurting as that. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Li Guofu, Harlan Ullman, Joseph Brommel, and Ian Begg. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for coming to our show. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. I talked with celebrity American businessman and investor, traveler Jim Rogers. He weighs in on the volatility of equity markets and dealing with Trump administration policies. A full interview right after this break.